And in this segment of the show, we will be talking with Professor Amir Sufi about his book, his very important research, and the book which he co-authored with Atif Mian, entitled House of Debt, How They and You Caused the Great Recession and How We Can Prevent It from Happening Again. Professor Sufi is a professor of finance at the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. He is also a research assistant at the National Bureau of Economic Research. He serves as associate editor for the American Economic Review and the Quarterly Journal of Economics. His research focuses on finance and macroeconomics. He's won numerous prizes, far too numerous to list here. He's been profiled many times. He has great background academically and technically in the field of economics. He and Professor Mian have also written an extremely readable and, in my opinion, very important book about the nature of the 2008 crisis and what followed. Pete, do we have Professor Sufi with us?
Yep, I'm here.
Oh, excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you for writing what I consider to be an extremely important book about the nature and sources of our current crisis. And I could attempt to summarize your central thesis and give the elevator pitch, but I would feel much more comfortable if you did it.
Oh, yeah, sure. I'm happy to. So we basically have written a book with the central question, what causes severe economic downturns? And we focus primarily on the Great Recession in the United States, and it is our view based on 6 or 7 years of academic research, which of course we've written in a presentable audience, for a general audience, is that the dramatic rise in household debt from 2000 to 2007, in combination with the dramatic decline in house prices during the Great Recession, is essentially what triggered the Great Recession, a sharp decline in household spending, and at the end of the day kind of sent the economy into a tailspin, and it was very difficult to recover from it.
So thank you for that. And I happened to read your book during the same week that I read and reviewed Timothy Geithner's memoir, Stress Test. And one of the main takeaways I took from your book, which, by the way, points out that much of this data was not previously available. You guys have and Heather Boucher wrote a piece and pointed out the same thing. You have discovered some new things along the way. But one of the key things that I took away is that, contrary to the statements that others might make, in my opinion, including Geithner, that, we get Jamie Dimon famously said, I told my 7-year-old daughter these disruptions happen every 5 to 7 years, and it's almost like an act of nature. But I think one of your central theses is that, one, they're not an act of nature, they're human-made, and two, that in this case, refine my statement, correct it where necessary, but in effect that the financial crisis was not the important part of what happened of 2008. That was a symptom of an underlying disease, which was this bubble in housing prices, which was bound to collapse, and then the ongoing impact on the economy of the debt which that left on so many millions of Americans. A fair statement?
Yeah, that's right. So I think, the real advantage of our approach is that we have gathered a tremendous amount of microeconomic data, which allow us to zero in detail on what actually is causing the severe economic downturn. And when you zero in on the actual data, it tells a very compelling story, and that is, when house prices crashed, especially in areas of the country that had very high debt burdens, households dramatically pulled back in spending. And in fact, this dynamic actually started and was in full swing even prior to the collapse of Lehman Brothers in September of 2008. So, for example, we show that spending on autos, on furniture, on home improvement, even in August of 2008, was almost 10% down from 2007, again, before Lehman Brothers. Obviously, the housing crisis then led to the banking crisis. In some sense, we need to make sure we understand what the cause and the effect was. The financial crisis was a result of the housing crisis. And, of course, the financial crisis and the banking crisis amplified the effect of the downturn. But, again, even in the heart of September, October, November, December of 2008, the areas of the country that saw the biggest decline in spending and the biggest increase in unemployment were the areas that were getting hit hardest by the housing crisis. So our view is very much contrary to the view of Mr. Geithner and others, where they place the banking crisis as the central feature of the Great Recession, and we actually think that's mistaking an effect for a cause. The real cause was elevated household debt and a housing crash that led to a massive pullback in spending.
Well, and let's talk about the implications of that for a second, if we might. We're talking with Professor Amir Sufi about his book, House of Debt. If that's the case, then from a policy point of view, the interventions which focused on the banking institutions impacted by the financial crisis didn't get to the heart of the matter, and the real heart of the matter was interventions which could reduce household debt. And according, if I interpret your research correctly, and the book is very clearly written, that suggests that, in fact, specifically that portion of household debt held not by the wealthy so much as by the middle class and lower income homeowners, that by not addressing that, that's what's led to this enormous prolongation of recessionary features, unemployment, and the other problems we're facing today.
Yes, that's exactly correct, 100% correct. So our view is that, we don't want to take an extreme view that we're saying, we should have just let the banks fail. There was a need to stabilize the financial system in the fall of 2008. And in fact, we do commend some of the interventions that both the chairman of the Federal Reserve and Mr. Geithner, when he was at the New York Fed, do to kind of try to stabilize the financial system. Where our complaint comes is that it seems like policymakers had a very singular, almost tunnel vision approach to the problem, and that was what we call the view of the world that is, we save the banks and we save the economy. That the only problem was a banking crisis. That is absolutely incorrect. The problem was much deeper, and in fact, the banking crisis was a result of a household debt crisis. So you're exactly correct that the policy implications are that we should have moved much more aggressively to undertake actions that would help relieve the burden of debt by households. We actually don't favor taxpayer debt forgiveness. Instead, we thought that there needed to be a more even distribution of losses between the debtors and the creditors. So, for example, one of the specific proposals that I think Jen Taub in her book, Other People's Homes, is also talking about is that we should have allowed bankruptcy judges to write down mortgage debt in bankruptcy. That was legislation that candidate Barack Obama had supported in September of 2008, but then it never was passed in 2009. We think that, for example, was a huge mistake, something we discuss at length in the book.
And you're speaking, of course, of Jennifer Taub and her book, Other People's Houses. And you also mentioned very early on in your book the point that losses right now are completely maldistributed. That, in fact, you have, if I buy a $100,000 house and I have $20,000 in equity and the house drops in value to $80,000, I'm the one who loses out. The bank is still owed $80,000. So they're 100% in that scenario, and I'm zero. So if that's the case, then bankruptcy, I believe they call cram downs, and other solutions become appropriate. And I want to talk a little bit more about policy solutions, but perhaps a little bit more about causes. If you're able to stay with us through this break, Professor Sufi, I have a couple more questions for you afterwards. Can you stick with us?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, thanks so much, and I will be asking you about your subtitle when we get back. Amir Sufi is co-author of House of Debt, and we will be right back after this. I am Richard RJ Eskow, and this is The Zero Hour. And we are back on The Zero Hour. We are back, and with us is Professor Amir Sufi, co-author of House of Debt, How They and You, in parentheses, caused the Great Recession and How We Can Prevent It from Happening Again. And Professor Sufi, I wanted to ask you about that parenthetical inclusion in your title. Now, we've talked about how, to a certain extent, a little bit about how they, I want to talk a little bit more about the they as well as in the you. How did the collective we of the American people contribute, in your estimation, to this recession?
So our view is that one of the most dangerous things about debt is the way in which people who may be prone to kind of more myopic behavior, may not think about the future, may excessively borrow when they don't actually have fundamental improvements in wages or income. So the idea is that there were, during the housing boom years, a substantial part of the population who were very aggressively borrowing against home equity in order to finance consumption, basically to finance spending. And that basically led to a situation where you had this dramatic rise in household debt. So that's the sense in which we mean the and you. Now, of course, that process is only possible if there is a group of lenders that are willing to lend money to people who may not be able to actually afford the debt payments in the long run. So our view is that it's kind of a shared responsibility problem, that both lenders and borrowers were in some sense behaving irresponsibly. And at the end of the day, that's why we believe when the crash comes, both the lenders and the borrowers should experience some loss. Instead, what we got essentially was that the borrowers were forced to bear all the losses, and the lenders pretty much escaped unscathed.
Well, I understand your point of view, and I certainly think from a dispassionate researcher's perspective, it makes a lot of sense. I also think in terms of economics and incentives, it makes sense that if there's some pain for excessive borrowing, it perhaps improves. It's an appropriate feedback system for the economy. And I just wanted to run something by you, though, which is I am by nature and profession a bit more of an advocate and perhaps a bit more of a firebrand and a little bit less of a dispassionate researcher. So part of me, it says, and this is more just me talking to you than what the research or your numbers say, part of me says, well, okay, but we have a situation where there's been wage stagnation over an extended period of time, growing income inequality as well as wealth inequality, and that in effect, this easy credit, which extended over a period of a number of years, was a pressure valve that allowed this inequality to continue while people maintained the illusion of that their middle class lifestyle was still sustainable. And that, in effect, when people applied for, a home line of credit or whatever, that they were, in effect, being told by the financial system, it's okay, it'll work out. So I might apportion a lot more of the blame to the financial system and a bit less. I understand what you're saying, but what would you say to somebody like me who says, well, people were basically set up. This was a way to kind of disguise growing wealth inequality, and then when everything hit the fan, they were left holding the bill.
Yeah, no, I think we're closer. We're closer than maybe I gave the impression before. I think that it's, of course, a product of a situation in which we have a rise in income and wealth inequality, and at that point, a lot of people do become convinced that the only way in which they can keep their spending behavior up to a middle-class standard is by taking on debt. And it's almost a sure thing that a lot of the people that are borrowing don't understand fully what they're taking on in terms of the burden of debt that they're going to have going forward. So I completely agree with you that a lot of the blame deserves to be put on the lenders. And in fact, in the book, we make the very strong argument that one of the reasons debt fuels bubbles like the housing bubble that we just witnessed is not so much because the buyers become too optimistic. It's because somebody out there is willing to lend money to people who are willing to pay a lot for houses. So I think what really changed in the early 2000s, which I think is consistent with your views, was an increased willingness of lenders to really push mortgage credit onto people that did not fully understand exactly what they were taking on. So I think that is kind of one of the main arguments we make both in our research and the book.
So, okay, good. Well, I'm delighted to hear we're much closer together than I thought. And was I off base? When I wrote about your book and your work this week, I said, in fact, I think my title was something along the lines of "We saved the wrong economy," kind of implying there were there were two economies, that, to use Geithner's airplane analogy, that we saved the front of the plane, but we didn't save most of the plane. And now what we're saying, if you look at the charts at the end of his book, are, well, on average, the plane's doing pretty well, but the biggest part of the cabin is still plummeting. And was that, in your opinion, the wrong analogy, the right analogy?
No, I think it's exactly. Yeah, it's exactly correct. And I think it's easy enough to look at just the data on who the income gains and the wealth gains from the last 4 or 5 years have gone to, and they have disproportionately gone to the wealthiest Americans, especially because stock prices have risen quite sharply, asset prices generally have gone up a lot, and of course 85% of the financial wealth in the economy is owned by the top 20% of the wealth distribution. So just naturally, if wages are stagnant, but financial values, financial asset prices, stocks and bonds, if those are going up, then that is going to disproportionately benefit those at the top of the wealth distribution. And I think you're exactly right that a lot of the decisions that were made during the financial crisis to uniquely focus on saving banks led to a situation in which you see a further divergence between what's going on at the top 10% of the income distribution versus, say, the median or even below the median of the distribution.
So, okay, great. I think it sounds like we are exactly on the same page then, more or less. And in the couple minutes we have left, and I realize that's an absurdly short length of time, but we've talked about mortgage. Here we are at this moment in history, and we can all regret what wasn't done over the last 5 years, but what are a couple policy solutions that we might still approach, at least to mitigate the problem as it currently exists?
Yeah, so we're very much focused on the problem of student debt, which I think is the biggest financial issue that we face on the household side. Student debt burdens have exploded, and we actually have an opinion piece coming out in the Washington Post where we're thinking about ways in which we can do some kind of debt forgiveness on the student debt side based on when you graduated. So the idea is, if somebody graduates in 2009 with a lot of student debt, we cannot blame that person for having taken on that debt and then being exposed to this horrible job market. In that kind of environment, it makes sense to actually forgive some debt. This is similar to Senator Warren's proposal, where she has advocated allowing students to refinance, or former students, people with student debt, to refinance into lower interest rates in order to lower their interest payments. Both ideas basically say, look, if the economy is suffering and people can't find jobs, then it doesn't make sense to enforce debt contracts and to make people continue to pay the same high interest payments, because through no fault of their own, they don't have as good of labor income, and so it makes a lot of sense in that circumstance to do some debt forgiveness. So we're really focused on student debt in terms of the message of the book going forward.
Well, although I do have to say, and I appreciate both your proposal and Senator Warren's, but the phrase debt forgiveness, is that the right phrase? We're really talking about refinancing at more favorable rates, but that's not what I normally think of as debt forgiveness.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way we would like to see debt contracts work, and maybe forgiveness isn't the right word for it, is we would like to see the balance on debt adjust if the economy collapses automatically. Mm-hmm. And that's, whether you want to call that forgiveness or refinancing, the principle is basically the same. It is, we want to let Americans be able to share risk more broadly. Right now, it's kind of a raw deal. The financial system doesn't bear any of the risk, and the student who's, a young American that's just starting their lives, probably with low assets because obviously they haven't had a lot of time in the workforce, they're bearing such a large amount of aggregate economic risk. And in our view, that just doesn't make sense. And that's something I think we need to think seriously about reforming.
Oh, well, I couldn't agree with you more. I might lean towards more radical solutions, but they also might not be politically feasible. And certainly at a minimum, it seems to me the most reasonable of all proposals to adjust these rates accordingly, especially in this kind of economy, and especially with young people's unemployment being so dramatically high as it is now, correct?
Yeah, exactly. I think the only difference between what Senator Warren has discussed and what we're discussing is the only problem we have with her proposal is it would require students to actively, or former students to actively go out and refinance, whereas what we're kind of proposing would just be automatically done. So you wouldn't even actually have to do anything yourself. As soon as market conditions deteriorate, unemployment goes up, your principal balance and your interest payments get lower. That's really the only difference. But at the end of the day, both of us are on the same page in terms of the goal we're trying to accomplish.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, but I'm going to encourage people to read your book, Amir Sufi, co-author of House of Debt, How They and You Caused the Great Recession and How We Can Prevent It from Happening Again.